for those who came on Zoom. Um, so what I'm going to try to do is just share the tricks that I've learned about growing plants here in the valley. So I've been doing this I've lived in the Southwest desert my whole life and always have loved plants since I was a little kid, and kind of hobbied it for a long time and got into the industry professionally in 1995. And ever since, I mean, all that, I've just tried to grow anything I could, anything you find. Sometimes you mail order stuff in that you hope might work here. And I've honestly killed a lot of stuff too, but that's how you learn, and that's how I can share that information with you guys too. We'll talk first about picking the plants that grow here. It's like there's a difference between surviving here barely with all the effort you can give something, and something that really, really thrives here on its own. So every bit of effort you give to it makes it all the better. So that's what we're going to talk about, is selecting those plants and then how to treat them so that they can become plants that grow in your yard without a whole lot of care, but just are the most beautiful, pleasing thing that you could have out there without all the failures, over and over. And I think a lot of people, they think that they're not good with plants because they've failed a few times, killed a few things, but I don't think it's luck at all to have a black thumb or whatever. It's given up, really, probably. You tried a few times, didn't have a lot of luck, and maybe you gave up on the whole thing. You will learn the tricks. I'll share with you everything I've learned, and hopefully with that, you'll decide you have a green thumb after all, and get some plants going that just really are exciting to have and make you happy every time you walk through your yard. So we'll talk about that, how to get there, and also in the end, this is a water conservation class. So it's going to be about how to have those beautiful plants that you enjoy in your yard and also save water at the same time, because you're not pumping water onto something that's barely hanging on because it really doesn't grow here, or really isn't being treated properly or watered properly in the way that it should. So we'll go to the next slide. It's recorded too, right? So my email is on that first slide, and don't ever be afraid. Yeah, sorry, maybe go back to it. That's my email, and don't ever be afraid to email me with any questions or pictures or whatever. So I'll always get back to you as soon as I can. And nowadays, it's so much easier than going all over town, seeing people's yards and trying to diagnose problems and all that. With a couple pictures and a couple questions back and forth, hopefully we can get anything you need figured out in the future with that email. So, okay. So plant selection and placement. Next slide. How do you want like a? All right. So this is just an example. If you like palm trees in general, that you could choose the one on the left, queen palms, or you could choose the one on the right, Canary Island date palms. So there's two different kinds of palms: the fan type, leaf, and the frond type leaf. And a lot of people like that ferny leaf of the frond type. And so you have choices like this in the nursery. And if you see this yellow and brown in the queen palms on the left is about as good as it gets. I mean, I've seen a couple really nice queen palms in town, but I've seen hundreds and hundreds of dying or dead ones. They're just not quite adapted to our climate. They're from tropical parts of the world, so they like high humidity, which we obviously don't have here. And they like rainforest soil, which doesn't have any salt in it whatsoever, which we have lots in our soil. So between the pH of our soil, the high salt, and the dry air, they're not really made for our climate. So as good as they look in the nursery, which means they've just arrived from Florida or California, and we buy them in, put them on the ground, and they go away to people's yards, and then they end up looking like this little by little. So like I say, people argue with me sometimes because their queen palm looks good, but I mean, it's rare. I'm talking about numbers, like percentages of trees I've seen out there. If you're in the market for something really easy to take care of and kind of similar, more or less, Canary Island date palms are from the Canary Islands, which is a super arid climate, desert climate, and they love our weather here. Date palms in general, for that matter. Pygmy date palms are a little dwarf one. Regular date palms that make dates are good here too. And that's a Canary Island date palm. So it's just an example of like, if you can open your mind up a little bit to, you want some kind of palm, and you can choose one that's super adapted to our climate, easy to take care of with just a regular watering. It can be a really nice plant that you never have to worry about why is all the leaves turning yellow, or all these problems that you got to do, extra fertilizer, treating the soil for pH and all that. They're easy. You plant them and water them and go. So it's like I say, it's one example. There's millions of examples of trees, for example. You want a dark green leafy tree that's evergreen. Well, there's a lot of choices for what works here, and there's a lot of choices that you might find in a nursery that wouldn't really grow here without a lot of extra care and a lot of extra failures, along the way. So it's just about picking climate or plants that come from a similar climate as ours. And a lot of times when I see a plant in a place that I think might be buying plants in from other parts of the country, I'll look it up. It's easy from your phone now, search it and see where they're from. And if they're from the tropics or from a temperate climate, there's already kind of some challenges that you're going to have to deal with. So try to pick plants that are from some other kind of subtropical or desert areas of the planet. And there's plenty, there's lots of parts of South America, South Africa, North Africa. There's Australia, lots of parts of Australia that we bring plants in from all those places that work great here without a lot of extra effort. So go ahead. This is an example not only of plants that are adapted to our climate, but plants, you have to consider their mature size and what kind of sunshine they're going to need. This is about everything else about the plant. So they might be a plant or a tree that's adapted to our climate. Both of these are. This little tree on the left is a southern live oak, which grow wonderfully here. A really good tree for our climate. And this big one on the right is a Dalbergia sisu tree or just sisu tree. They both work great here, but there's other things to consider like mature size. So those tree trunks are about 10 feet apart, and each one of those trees is going to want to get 30, 40 feet wide. How is that ever going to happen, And especially because the sisu is not only more vigorous, but it's got like a 10-year head start on that little tiny oak. It's going to swallow it up. I mean, there's really no chance for that little southern live oak on the left. But you just have to think about how big is this tree going to get and put it in a spot where it can get that big. Because people think I'm just going to trim it. But I mean, when are you going to go straight up from the property line there and have a tree that's all one side? It puts a tree off balance too, where it'll fall over eventually if you keep doing that. So if nothing else, it costs a lot of money to have trees trimmed too much. It hurts the tree if you keep trimming and trimming and trimming because it doesn't let them have the amount of leaves that produce the amount of energy that they need to live on. There's lots of problems beyond the roots of trees that big are going to crack both those driveways eventually. So all this situation is like no trees should probably go in that space between those two driveways. But it happens all the time. It's just kind of one of those accidents of quick development and building and all that. And I don't know, but just if you're putting a new tree in or even a bush, think about how big is it going to get and make sure it has that much room to grow to its full potential. It might look funny when you first put it in. People think they want to put something in that already fills the space that you planted into the first day, but everything continues growing. There's no plants that just stop right there and never grow again, So think about, so again, you can search it. What's a mature size of a Dalbergia sisu, and make sure that you have at least close to the amount of room that tree is going to need. And exposure, there is plants that grow very, very well here, but they love a little bit of shade in the afternoon, so they're capable of living here. But if you go putting one that needs a little afternoon shade out in the full sun, surrounded by gravel with your street and sidewalk and all that, it's not going to do good. You're going to fail at that plant, So you got to think about whether they need sun or shade, whether how big they get in the end, and they have size to get that big. And those things are important to consider too. So the species, like what types of plants you're putting out there, that they're desert adapted. And then the spot that you're putting them in is the right conditions for their mature size and their sun exposure that they need. And go ahead, the next slide. So how do you find those plants, right? The species that grow well here, this book is right over there and it's free. So the organization that produces it is called AMWA, Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, and that's their website. And you can find all the stuff in this and much more on their website. And it's a good list of most every plant that I've seen do very, very well here. So pretty extensive list. I continue trying new things all the time, it never hurts, but these are ones that are proven to do good in our climate. And it's a local publication. That's what you got to watch as you find information about gardening or plants or landscaping. Even if it was from Flagstaff, nothing would work here. It's local. You have to get information that's from at least Sonoran Desert, say, low desert. And the Desert Botanical Gardens is a wonderful place to walk through and see stuff growing in real life, you know, and something might catch your eye and everything's labeled. You can take the name down, try to find it somewhere in town at a nursery. So the Desert Botanical Gardens also has a annual plant sale that you could find plants at. So all the way around, it's a good place just to walk through and see how beautiful a desert adapted landscape could be. Nothing in that garden is not supposed to be in the desert, you know. So anything you find there would be wonderful choices for this climate in your yard. Next, that's just a picture of one of the, it's like the wildflower exhibit there. So you can go, it has everything from that kind of annual type stuff to super mature specimens of rare cactus and trees and stuff like that. Another one at night, you can go through the garden. They open it up at night, certain times of the year with different types of exhibits. They also have like events, you know, with like music, live music and stuff like that. So check the website out for all that stuff. So now you know what types of plants, and now we're going to the nursery to pick out. You got a plant in mind, you know, you've picked it out of the book or out of the going to the botanical gardens, and you have this plant you're looking for. Or maybe you call ahead. This nursery has it. Let's talk about what you're looking for in the nursery to find a healthy plant. There's a couple things that. So the right-hand picture, that tree that's yellow, it's not for sure that it has some kind of terminal problem, but it's a good chance. You know, the yellowing, why are all those other trees in that line dark green and that one's yellow? You know, there's root diseases that can cause that. I mean, it could be something simple, but it also could be something bad. Why would you pick it? You know, so pick something that's dark green, lush, and with new growth on it, preferably, you know, that shows that it's growing healthily. The how a plant is doing right now is always shown in that new little tip, the new leaves that are coming out. So if the new leaves are coming out good, that plant is healthy right now. It might have old leaves on it that are just plain old and turning yellow and falling off. That's not a problem. It's the new growth, and the new growth should be vigorous and dark green and growing good, you know, or whatever color that tree's supposed to be. um, but so just that's, I think that one's pretty obvious. You know, pick something healthy and vigorous when you're looking through them. And if they don't have any, wait and come back later, you know. Another thing that I think people don't realize is, see the root coming out of the picture on the left, the root coming out of the bottom of the pot. Very, very common with all nursery containers, especially trees, want to root out of that hole and into the ground. Well, the second they do, that becomes the biggest tree in the whole entire block. I could have 500 trees, and the first one that roots in the ground doubles in size over all the other ones. But from a customer's point of view, you see my 500 trees and this one is giant and the rest of them are little, you're going to pick the giant one, right? And the problem is a lot of times you might tag it, say I want that one, and have it delivered and planted, for example. What you don't know is after you leave, they go out there and chop these giant roots off that are going in the ground, and it creates this big stress up for the tree. So for every little bit of root that you cut off, you have to cut off a little bit of top to counterbalance it. You know, for every root underground, there's a leaf up top counting on it. That's the rule. It's like the roots bring water up to those leaves, and the leaves make sugar and put them back down to the roots. So there has to be a balance. They feed each other. So when you lose a whole bunch of root, the only way that I can get a tree to survive it is to trim really hard on top. Now you're chopping this tree back, and it ends up looking like all the little ones that you could have taken in the first place. So, and that's if it lives through it. Sometimes you don't notice that. You leave it big, nobody trims it. All the leaves wilt, turn yellow, fall off. Now you can have sunburn that comes in and burns the trunks and stems. It spirals into this big problem that you don't even know why it's all happening, you know? They call it transplant shock or something like that. But you should never have transplant shock if the plant was, you know, rooted well into the pot and not into the ground, and no roots were broken through the process of transplanting. So be careful of it. It's kind of one of those things I think a lot of people don't realize what's happening. It's easy to find out. Wiggle the pot if you're out there, you know. If it's a big box-sized tree, it's a little harder. You might ask the nursery to make sure it's not rooted in the ground. But in any kind of black pot, 15-gallon or littler, wiggle it back and forth. And if it's like stuck to the ground solid, that's what happened. And it's super common. Next slide. So here's how I can tell. This is all about, if some of you may have heard that when you plant a tree, you should cut roots, fluff roots out, you know, finesse them out, chop roots that are circled around, which is sometimes true, but it always causes stress for the tree, and usually especially here, if you were to do things like that in the summertime, break any kind of roots or cut any roots when you transplant a tree or bush, it's probably going to die. With our low humidity, high heat, it's best to keep all the roots intact, not break a one, and carefully put it down on the ground. But the reason you've heard that to cut roots is because if there's a root circling around, if the trunk comes out of the ground, this is an example. If the trunk comes out of the ground and there's a root up high right here that goes all the way around that trunk, that circle of root never gets any bigger in diameter, but the trunk does. So the trunk gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and that root chokes it. So it'll be like it chokes it out. And eventually, sometimes 10 years from now, the tree finally falls over and you realize that's what happened. So it's just something very serious to avoid when you're buying a tree. And all you have to do is dig with your finger a little bit where that trunk goes in the dirt. It'll be right there. I mean, if that root that goes around in a circle is all the way at the bottom of a 15-gallon pot, it doesn't matter because it's down there in a circle. A new root can go above it, or a new root can go above it to compensate. It's only when that circled root is right up there at the surface, which is good because that's where you can find it with your finger in the nursery when you're looking around. So just dig a little bit where the trunk goes in. It should be nice roots going out and down and not have some big wrapped around root. Fall is my favorite time to plant stuff. Yeah, because it has the long, our most severe weather is in the summer, right? That's the most dangerous weather for any plant. Even like a mesquite or something that loves the heat, you still wouldn't want to like chop a bunch of roots off and throw it in the middle of summer, you know? So the fall gives you the most amount of time for that plant to get established. That's what we'll talk about a lot, is about getting established. It gives it the most amount of time to get established before that severe time of year comes. If it's something that's frost sensitive, like it might freeze during the winter, like a hibiscus, for example, or something like that, you might wait till like March 1st because then you pass that frost danger. And then you still want to give it as much time as possible before the heat comes. I wouldn't plant anything like May, June, July. Now is good. Yeah. Just as you want as much time as you can for those roots to get down deep and strong before the heat starts beating anything up. So that's the circled root. Watch for that on a tree mainly. Bushes isn't as critical that you find the circled root, but it still doesn't help. And so look for that. And the other thing I really look for to see if a plant is root bound is the level of soil. Let's see how deep the soil is in this. No nursery plants that deep in the pot. They're always started like this. You leave maybe inch of room between the soil and the edge of the pot. And as time goes by, that soil decomposes and washes out the bottom. So if you got a plant with a half a pot full of soil, it means it's been around for years, getting more and more root bound. So just don't buy it. Don't buy it and try to cut the roots to compensate. And then you're just setting yourself up for failure again. So buy a plant that has a high soil level, no wrapped root like that. And you should be good to plant that plant without having to do any root pruning at all. To me, that's the trick. It's getting a good plant that doesn't need to be root pruned, and then put it in the ground as carefully as you can. And then transplant shock shouldn't be a thing. You know, it doesn't have to happen if you do all that. So next slide. There's a video on how to plant plants on there. There's lots. If you just search like how to plant a tree in Phoenix, Arizona, there's a lot of videos out there on YouTube and all that. There's just one of them. But it's about how to like cut the bottom, how to plant a tree that so you don't break all the roots off on accident. Because even if you don't try to cut the roots, there's trees like citrus trees, they never make enough root to hold all that soil together. If you grab the trunk and try to tap the pot off, all the roots and soil falls off at the same time, and you end up with like just a carrot of a thick root left. And then people still try to put it in the ground and all the leaves turn yellow and fall off, and then you have all these problems that continue. So carefully, but you can switch the slide. Yeah.
If anybody has questions.
Oh yeah, okay, sure. And yeah, I forgot the last question, but yeah, from now on I will. Okay. All right. So staking it, oh, you gotta push the slide again, I think. Yeah, so staking isn't always necessary. People think they always have to have these two lodge poles and the wire coming in. This is a perfect example of that multiple trunk tree would have been beautiful without any stakes. Somebody's like bunched them all together, ruined the structure of the tree. It probably goes with like the plans for this lot where every tree gets 2 lodge poles, so they bought them anyway, so let's put them on. But if you buy a multiple trunk tree or have one, it should never need to be staked. If it's holding itself up in the nursery, don't put stakes back on it for sure. Only if a stake is like holding the trunk up and you take that stake off and the trunk wants to bend over, then I would maybe put a stake on it. But first I would try to trim a little bit, and if you remove some of the weight off those top heavy branches, it might spring back up. Even then, I wouldn't put stakes on it. But if it really just won't stand back up with a little bit of pruning, then you need this whole system of 2 lodge poles, a ring in the middle, and you got to have room for it to wiggle, because the trunk wiggling around is what stimulates it to fatten up. If it's tied tight to a stake like we do in the nursery, it'll never fatten up because it doesn't have any reason to. It thinks the stake is part of its own self. So the only reason we put stakes on in the nursery is to make a straight trunk going up. It's not to like make it stronger or help in any kind of way. Yeah. Yeah, that is the question was, is that a mesquite tree? And it is. It's a nice multiple trunk mesquite tree, thornless hybrid mesquite. They do. You you trim it, yeah. So that, yeah, the question is like when they get, because mesquites grow so fast, they get top heavy and end weight, they call it. All that the branches get so long, they'll want to crash down, which is how mesquites grow in the wild. They're always touching the dirt, but it's not really something you want covering your whole yard. So what you do is trim and hit a good pruning class or something, because if you do just crown reductions over and over on them to keep them in check, is the best way instead of stake. Once you start putting stakes on, you're crippling a tree. Yeah, everything. They take end weight off the sides and a height reduction, but there's, if there's techniques to make it a healthy prune, and if you, it's a whole other class, but that's if you do, that's the way to fix that problem, not putting stakes on. Even a tree that kind of leans like that, I tend to trim to try to correct it and have some growth come out the other side, instead of trying to like tie the tree back to straight. Because once a tree leans or falls over, it's going to keep trying to forever, honestly. I mean, it's rare. In the rare case I've seen somebody tie it up for long enough that it kind of makes itself strong in that position. Usually once you tie it up like that or stake it, those stakes or ties are going to be there for the life of the tree. So it's, to me, it's better to trim accordingly. You remove that weight, heavy weight of the ends. Yeah, little by little, always little by little. You branch here, branch there. You can do it any time of year you want. A heavy prune, I wouldn't recommend ever, but if you had to do it, then you got to worry about what time of year, all that. So a branch by branch from the time they're little is the best way to fix that, not stakes. I think there's more about staking in here, or quite a bit more about staking. So that's a multiple trunk tree, right? And it's a beautiful multiple trunk tree with the angles of the branches coming off are good, healthy angles. If they're too tight, the angles, they have a tendency to crack and the branches come down. But that's a beautiful tree that I think a lot of people, maybe especially from other climates, you picture it's the image of a tree that's killing us here, because you think a tree is supposed to look like a lollipop or like a Christmas tree. That's how trees grow in a forest when they're competing with each other to get to the light. It's not the problem here at all. I mean, there's plenty of light for all the trees. So trees here, if you go for a hike, and you'll find that there's not one single trunk tree out there in the desert. They're all multiple trunk trees like this, and they all have growth that almost touches the ground, and they make this like microclimate underneath them. It's like they're an umbrella, and the wind goes up and over them nice without crashing them over, and they make this nice shady area underneath themselves to keep all their trunks in the soil cool. That's the way trees survive our climate in the wild without our help. So at least let them try. To me, a multiple trunk tree is, to me, the healthiest way for any tree to be in the desert. I know we all have trees that are single trunk from the get-go. Sometimes you buy them that way. Sometimes you move into a house that are like that. But just know that it's the healthiest way to be. And the higher you trim branches, the more sun hits these trunks, and the more chance that you have of sunburn along here. And even if they don't sunburn, which is kind of one of the biggest killers of trees, they can just heat up that juice. Remember, every leaf is sending sugar down to the roots, and every root is sending water up to the leaves. This is like a high traffic freeway system here for water going back and forth. And when you get direct sunlight on all those sugars and water going back and forth, it hurts the whole system in the summer, you know. So you got to remember that it's like low. I think the next slide is, yeah. So this is how citrus trees grow naturally, and for that exact reason. Citrus trees are horrible about if you were to like, I want to get under this tree, let's trim it up to here like all at once, you know, and lift that skirt all the way up to half the tree, say. It looks nice. Now you can get under there, but the first thing that's going to happen is the sun's going to come in there and burn the trunk. Maybe a year later, you wonder how come all the bark is peeling off, you know, and it's not growing like it used to. It's another one of those spirals where now you get bugs can get in from the burnt wound and they just never grow the same again. So a hard prune, especially in the summer, where you let a lot of light into any tree really, but especially citrus trees, is like terminal. You know, it's something that can damage them for life, and it's something that they can't always come back from. So just try to know those concepts about low, shady, and just work with it. You know, it's like you got to have your space too. You got to have a tree that's what you want in your yard, but knowing that that's what they're trying to do, uh, let them be sometimes. Sometimes suckers will come out from mesquite trees at the bottom. And that's on in other climates. I know you never would let suckers grow on a tree, but here sometimes those suckers can be new trunks. You know, if you do have a single trunk mesquite that keeps falling over, falling over, falling over, and some suckers come out the side, let them grow into trunks and have it be like that Palo Verde in the previous slide. You know, you can do that here. And with the trees that we grow or desert trees. Get behind. There's a one of those lodge poles, those stakes left with a little bit of the wire, and this is the wire that's choking out that trunk. It's so the trunk this has been left on for so long that the trunk is now like is swallowing up that wire, which is a terminal problem too. So see how much fatter it is above the wire? The wire's getting swallowed up right there. See how much fatter it is above it? Remember all those sugars that the leaves are making, trying to send it down to the root? Well, they can't get there, so it backs up. Sometimes sap will ooze out of the sides of it above that wire. So the root system on this tree is starving to death. The roots don't make their own energy, right? Only leaves do. The leaves feed the roots. And so if they can't get that food to the roots, now you got a tree with a dinky little weak root system underground that you can't see, all because it can't get through that suffocated spot again. The next one's, again, I think about the same thing. So this was a wire that you can't even see anymore that got swallowed up. See how fat the bubble is around it? Same thing. Well, the trees, no problem. We'll just grow suckers out both sides, abandon the original trunk. And like I say, this tree that's a Dalbergia sisu again. And if you chopped it off all the way to the ground, it would find a way. It would pop up suckers out of the ground. So that to the tree will survive. It just won't survive in a way that you want to look at in your front yard, you know? So remember the whole point, take them stakes and wire off. To me, my rule is if the tree trunk, live, rubbery, flexible, is the same diameter as the lodge pole, it's time to take the lodge poles off. I mean, I'm not guaranteeing that tree is not going to go over, but you could focus on trimming a little bit to keep the weight off of the top. Those stakes aren't holding up a tree anymore. They'll snap right off. If it is going over, it's taking the stakes with it at that point. So there's not doing any good when the diameter of that tree trunk is the same diameter or bigger than the stakes themselves. It's time to take them off and deal with what happens and then trim a little bit to compensate. And hopefully you can get trees that don't need stakes from the beginning. Just the trees don't always need stakes is the point. Go ahead. So the pruning is a little bit about pruning. So first decide if it's necessary or not. Like not everything needs to be pruned, you know, and a lot of landscapers will tell you it does because they want a monthly fee. You know, it's like we'll prune something, you know, out there, whatever we can find because they want to be on a cycle of like every month coming. Things don't always need to be pruned. So decide why are you pruning it? You know, is it doesn't, if you have a good reason that maybe it's in the way or it's structurally unsound as a tree, it might break someday because of the way it is, or they just have a reason, you know, because just like a routine, people think they have to prune, they have bushes, they have to prune them, you know, but it's not always the case. So have a good reason. Every leaf, remember, I keep talking about, so every leaf does photosynthesis, it makes sugar, and that feeds the whole plant, you know, so every leaf on it is making energy for that plant. If you were to chop all the leaves off a plant, what happens? is like starves to death until it gets some back out. So it looks pretty sometimes when you chop plants real hard like that, because all these brand new little shoots pop out, fluffy green little new shoots. But from the plant's point of view, it's like an emergency situation. Like I'm gonna die if I don't get some kind of leaves out there. So when they do that, they don't, like trees, for example, don't concern themselves with, are these going to be healthy, strong branches? It's like, I just got to get leaves out there, any kind of leaf, you know? So the branches that grow back from that kind of prune are weakly attached. They can break off later. There's problems to it other than just the plant starving to death. Some plants don't seem to mind. They're so strong, so tough. They deal with what we do to them. And so if you pick those kind of plants, it might be okay. But all these things are just try to get you to work with the plant, you know, is how you make a plant stronger and stronger is what we're trying to do. So don't ever prune too much all at once. Not only are you removing leaves that are like a plus to the plant, not a draw, but you're also opening it up to where sun can get in there and burn those trunks and branches, especially in the summertime. But I've seen it even happen in the winter. I mean, we have a lot of evergreen trees here, like trees that don't lose all the leaves in the winter. And even those trees, if you remove all the leaves in the winter, that sun can burn the skin of the trunk and the branches too. So if a tree, the only time you can do that is if a tree loses its leaves in the winter, fully deciduous, like all the leaves fall off, that would be a good time to trim a tree as hard as you want, you know. And like peach trees, I do that on purpose, you know. In the winter, when there's no leaves on them, I like to keep them short and bushy so they protect the fruit that way and everything. It's a rare case, you know. Most things, if there's leaves on them year round, there's no good time of year to trim that hard, like to remove all the leaves at once. But if they all fall off at once by themselves, that would be the only time you could get away with that. And when you're pruning, step back and see what you've done often. You know, I've done it myself where I'm in the zone, you know, chop, chop, chop. And next thing I know, I step back and think, I should have stopped half an hour ago, you know. So just keep walk around the whole thing, see what it looks like from different angles. And if you're not sure if you should keep going or not, stop and come back in a month or two when it gets a chance to recover, you know. Let you trim a little bit, let it recover. It'll grow new leaves, continue getting healthier, and then come back and trim a little more, trim a little more, little by little. Um, if nothing else, when you trim little by little, it fits in your garbage can and it goes away instead of having to hire a dump truck to come get it all. So that's the last advantage to trimming little by little. All these say the same thing. If you have to trim it all, trim little by little. This is sunburn. So it usually takes about a year for people to realize what happened. So about a year ago, probably in the middle of summer, this is a desert tree, huh? It's a sweet acacia tree, super desert tree. And still it sunburned in the middle of summer when somebody chopped the whole top of it off. So there's all these things happening, right? The water goes from the roots up out the leaves all day in the summer. That's how everything stays cool. Cool water from underground goes up the trunk and out the leaves. And that happens all day like a river going up, right? So what happens when you chop all the leaves off a plant? For one, no more water's moving because it can't go out the leaves. So you've stopped the flow of water for one. Even if it's sitting in water, it still won't flow up the trunk to keep it cool. So you've removed the leaves that were where the water was evaporating out of. You've stopped the flow of water. And if you ever notice like a stream stays cooler than a puddle, you know, it's like the moving water stays cool, especially moving from underground up like that. When you stop it, it just boils in that trunk. So that's when you get this sunburn, it can also happen from drought, severe drought. But in this case, that tree can handle some severe drought from our desert. It wasn't that. It was the fact that you chopped so much off the top. So now you've stopped the flow, boiled the water in the trunk, and the sun can actually reach the trunk because you removed all the shade of the leaves above it. All these things combine to where this is one of the most common reasons trees fail here. This is the peely bark. This whole strip of bark in the middle is like you would notice that it's peeling off. The stuff on the sides, the rolls of good looking tissue that's trying to grow back over that wound. It'll take years and years and years if it ever does. That there's a hole. Can they see the cursor too, right? Yeah, cool. That hole right there is from a borer beetle, right? A borer like you hear about, it's killing the forest, whatever. Our borer beetles that live in the low desert only eat dead wood. So people come into the nursery all the time looking for what poison to kill borers with. They would have never needed it if they wouldn't have let the tree sunburn. So the skin sunburns, then the borer can chew through the dead sunburned trunk. So if you don't let them sunburn, you shouldn't have any problems with borers here in the low desert. So the initial problem was that, not the borer beetle. All the borers do is eat all the dead tissue and then go away. So go ahead. Switch. It's bushes. We talked all about trees. Pruning bushes. There is techniques that are that make plants less resistant to drought and all that. Hedging is what they are. So when you naturally a bush around here, any kind of desert adapted bush, right? In the spring, they put on a lot of growth. And as it starts getting hot, May, June, windy, hot, dry weather, all those leaves that grew, they like harden off, they get strong to the heat because they know it's coming worse and worse. So if it's a desert adapted shrub, it's going to have that cycle of like lots of growth in the early spring, and then that growth hardens off. So what happens when you chop it all off? It gets that emergency response. Like, now I got no leaves. I got to make some kind of leaves. Boom, all this fluffy, pretty leaves come out. But at a really bad time of year for fluffy green leaves, like they're softer, they lose a lot more water. So when you do this over and over and over all summer long, they tend to the ones we use survive it, but they're not thriving. I mean, remember, we're talking about thriving, not surviving. So it is a way that you can, if you leave shrubs in a more natural form, there's ways to trim that aren't hedging like that. Because hedging you got to do often. It gets out of its form, and then you go back and hedge it again and again. It's the landscaper's dream because it's like a monthly fee. You come back every month, hedge them again, and get paid again. But it's not the best way to save water or have a really healthy drought resilient plant. The plant that grew and then hardened off for the summer would be a much healthier plant. You can form bushes though and trim little by little, like we talked about. Next slide. So this is it's oleanders, just what I had around to do the example on, but this could be yellow bells or orange jubilee or all these bushes that just get like giant really fast, and you want to control their size somehow. The first step would be to find so the problem's the height. You find the tallest branch there is and you follow it down to where it starts at the ground. This is going to be a lot of slides in a row. So you can snip off just the tallest branch right there at the ground level, and all of a sudden you can knock off 2-3 feet of this bush, and then you go to the next slide. And so you can't even see that it was trimmed. The nub is way down there low. And then the next slide. And when you look at the bush, you can't tell that it was trimmed either because it doesn't have this flat top on it, or like sides or whatever. So the beauty of it is flower buds, huh? I still left flower buds on it. The bush looks like a bush still. It's still got flowers on it, still got new growth on it, but it's like however many feet shorter just by taking 1 or 2 of those big, strong, vigorous canes out of the middle. You could stop there, or you could continue, take a few more little off. And was there a slide back? Yeah, like this. So this would be, instead of cutting off this one all the way down at the bottom, you could also, where my pruners are, you could take one out there. And it's like this is how you trim a tree, a healthy prune on a tree. A crown reduction would be that you leave small branches behind where you make the cuts. And that way it doesn't look all chopped. When you're done, it shouldn't look like you made any cuts. The cuts should be kind of hidden in there. And there should be like new tips that are still there the way that the plant wanted it to be. So that'd be another cut you could make. And next slide. And I mean, it's like I say, I probably wouldn't have done all that at once, maybe little by little, but for the example, that's like, it's just a method of keeping shrubs in check where you still leave the shape of a shrub and some flowers left over, and a much healthier way for the plant when you do that little by little instead of this hedging all the time to shape them into some kind of shape. So now about water, huh? And this is the big thing about making resilient landscapes. It's a water conservation class, remember, and water is how we really get plants stronger and stronger to drought, is by working with the irrigation. So this part of it is very important to creating resilient established plants. So established, I should say, is an established plant. Like when you first plant anything in the ground, it's not established at all. Its roots are still locked in that little pot that you'd put in the ground. As those roots grow deep and wide into the ground, it gets stronger and stronger. For maybe it's an extra hot day or it's super windy today. Wind really dries plants out. But if they have a really strong, healthy root system underground that can store water, they don't, those kind of things don't affect them anymore. You know, they survive all those ups and downs of the weather, and you can start watering less often and less often and less often. And some landscapes, if you pick all desert adapted plants, some landscapes you could eventually, after 5, 6 years of doing this, like stretching out that cycle, you could turn off your irrigation system all the way, and maybe go out there once or twice through the summer on the hottest, driest days, push the semi-auto button, you know, have them water one time and turn it back off. You know, it's very possible that you could do that after 5, 6 years of doing what we're going to talk about doing to your landscape. This is where you really get into like water conservation and having a landscape that's like resilient to all those ups and downs of the weather. So the basic, super basic concepts of irrigation here are, when you do water, you want the water to soak in real deep. 3 feet, I would say, for any bush or tree. You know, little flower beds and all that's different. Vegetable gardens is different. It's not quite so deep. We're gonna talk about trees and shrubs. 3 feet deep is where the water stays cool in the summer. Remember, the water I was talking about goes up through the plant all day. If it's 3 feet deep, it's nice and cool down there to keep that plant cool through the summer. It's also where evaporation can't get it. So if you soak the water into the first 6 inches of soil, and the roots are down here at 3 feet, the roots aren't getting any water, and the 6 inches of water you put down evaporates into the air. So you've wasted 6 inches of water, and the tree's still dying of drought, you know? So it's about getting the water down to where the roots are, and only the roots can get it, not this dry air that wants to suck it up out of the top of the surface. So it's all about soaking the water in real deep. And then when you do that, you don't have to water as often. As the roots grow down into that moisture that's 3 feet deep, now you got a situation where you don't have to water every day, maybe not even every week, and eventually maybe not even ever. So that's how we're going to get to the point where you can go longer and longer between irrigation cycles, but you have to do a few things to get there. So we'll talk about that. So there's 3 ways to not water enough, right? Too much water is easy. Too much water is if the soil never dries out, it could be too much water. That's the only way it could be too much water, is if every time you go out there for weeks and months, it's wet every time. Your irrigation system kicks on again when it's still wet from the last time. That could be too much water, and it can damage plants. It's not as common as not enough water. Not enough water, there's 3 ways to be not enough water, and I find all 3 of them, sometimes all 3 of them in the same yard, sometimes one or the other or the other. So the first is depth, and we talked about it a little bit. You want that water to soak in deep. And if you're from a climate where you can go out with the hose and kind of sprinkle everything off and it's fine, it's not here. So you got to put that water down deep where it's safe from our dry air and where the roots can get it. And the depth of the water is on your timer, it's the run time is the only thing that changes that. If it's not soaking in deep enough, water longer. It's how long you put that water on. If it's with the hose or with the drip system, the longer you leave that hose dripping, or the longer the water comes out, the deeper it's going to soak in. That makes sense, right? So if you're not soaking it in deep enough, then start. So the area, I see this a big problem a lot when we install landscapes here. Usually every plant gets 1 drip emitter right there at the trunk. Well, that was good for like a 5-gallon bush that just got installed. But as the bush is now 6 feet by 6 feet, it's got a lot more leaves, needs a lot more water, and it's going to need more drip emitters. So it's like a lot of times I see plants suffering from drought. The timer's set perfectly. The area that gets wet has nothing to do with the timer. You can put the run time as long as you want and water as frequently as you want. But if it doesn't have enough gallons of water coming out when it waters, that's the problem. So you got to add drip emitters to get the rule here is the whole area under the plant should get wet when it waters. If it's a big tree, it's hard, but you still got to try to get the whole area underneath the plant wet when it gets wet. And again, not every day, but the whole area under the plant should get wet, should all soak in 3 feet deep, and then you're good for a longer period of time. And then the last one is frequency, and that one's the one people think about. When I say you're probably not watering this enough, everyone's mind goes straight to like, I'm not watering often enough. You know, that's the most common one that I think people go to is if they think something's not getting enough water, they don't water it deep enough, and they don't have enough gallons of water coming out when they water, but they water it every day, you know, so the frequency doesn't fix everything. You could be watering every day and still not giving enough water to that plant. Go ahead. So the depth, for that we talked about that. How do you find the depth, I guess? Well, this is a good example of different types of soil. So we have all three in the valley. If you live in the flat part of the valley, you probably have a nice, good, we used to be all agriculture for that reason. It's really good sandy loam, a little bit of clay, a little bit of sand, drains really good, but stays wet for a long time. If you get into the hilly parts of town that are desert around your neighborhood and like canyons and stuff like that, you might get real sandy soil, gravelly sandy soil, and that's a little more of a problem. And clay, I find it in the valley, usually where people have driven heavy equipment over wet soil and it gets compacted more and more and more, and then water doesn't go through it anymore. So those are the extremes of soil. And what changes is, I'll start with the sandy. If you live in the hilly parts of town and desert around, if you got really gravelly, sandy soil, which I've seen soil where you leave the hose on full blast and it just dives in and doesn't make a puddle, you know what I mean? That's the worst case scenario. And if that was the case, you'd have to amend that soil with some clay and sand to get it to hold water a little better. But what you do with irrigation on sandy soil is you got to have a lot of gallons come out at once, really heavy flow drip emitters, right? Like the water has to come out really fast, but not run for very long because it soaks in really quick. It just doesn't spread out really quick. So if you had one little drip emitter that's 1 gallon per hour, that drip of water is going to go straight to China and still never spread out. So if it's really sandy, really gravelly, high flow of water, and for a short period of time, your run time might only be a half an hour on that. The exact opposite on really heavy clay. If you put that much water on heavy clay, it would spread out, run down the street into the gutter and away, and it would never soak into your 3 feet deep. So in that case, you want a very slow drip, very low flow drip emitters, 1 gallon per hour, and you run them for a really long time. Could be your run time on that could be 3-4 hours to soak it into 3 feet deep. Those are the extremes. You're probably in the middle somewhere, 2-hour run time with a pretty heavy flow drip emitter, so the water spreads out a little bit. That's the why soil matters, and that's also why I can't just tell you all like go home and set your timer for 2 hours once a week and you're good, because everybody's soil's different. So that's what you adjust according to your soil, more or less. And remember, in the end, it's all about you want the whole area wet under the plant. If it's not getting the whole area wet, add more drip emitters or heavier flow drip emitters. And how do you check how deep it's going is the hard part, if your plants look good, I would say it's probably getting deep enough. If you live in the flat part of town with not a lot of rocks in the soil, a soil probe works really good. It's like a metal rod. You could buy a metal rod for that matter at a hardware store, 1/4-inch metal rod that's 3 feet long. And right when you're done watering, I mean, like it's still soppy mud, you slide that rod through the wet, soppy mud, and it'll slide right through it with no resistance. And the second you hit dry soil, you'll feel it. And then you pull it back out, see how far it went in. The only other way I know how in gravelly or soil or rocky soil is to dig a hole, set a drip emitter on a piece of ground. Perfect opportunity if you're going to plant a new plant, put the drip emitter first on the hole, on the spot where you're going to plant it, turn your drip system on the way you think it should run. And then when you go a day later, usually, so it's not like sticking to the shovel, it'll be moist and you'll go digging out that moist soil and you'll see how far it soaked in. If it didn't soak in far enough, what do? You stretch the runtime out longer and longer and longer until you get down to 3 feet deep, So it's a little hard, but once you've diagnosed that, once you figure out how deep 2 hours of water goes in your soil, it's never going to change with the weather, with the season, with the age of your house. Once you figure that out, it's that way forever. So it's a good bit of information to have for your soil and your drip system, how long it takes to soak it in 3 feet deep. All right, go on. So that's just an example of like how much area with drip emitter. The purple is like one drip emitter, right? So it is hard to get a big tree, and that's where you want the water to be, out at the edge of the drip line, because that's where the roots that absorb water are. The roots that go like where the trunk goes in the ground, the big roots that come off the trunk, they don't absorb water, they just carry water. So the roots that absorb water, all the little fine root hairs, are out at the edges of where the leaves are underground. That's where you want to put the water. As the tree gets bigger, you keep moving those drip emitters, or adding drip emitters even better, out at the drip line.
city of Goodyear requires you have a parkway that you have one tree in the parkway for every 25 feet.
So the city of Goodyear requires you have one tree for every 25 feet of parkway. Okay.
Well, that parkway is only 3 feet wide. I've been in my home 5 years. The tree looks wonderful, but now it's got to the point where it's overhanging the sidewalk. And I've got to trim up walk along the street. I don't want to put meters.
Yeah.
Sidewalk.
Tree roots will find water, so you can run it lengthwise. They'll find it, or they'll be underneath the pavement to wherever they can find it. So, I mean, if the tree looks good, it looks good, and that's really in the end, that's all that matters. But yeah, good.
Is there a way to stop
We're talking about you watch for signs of drought, and you can ride a line where they don't really grow vigorously, but they stay healthy, and we'll talk about that. That's the way you do it. You stretch out that irrigation cycle to the point where they're not growing like crazy all the time and having to trim them and all that, but they're perfectly healthy. I mean, that's the way they live in the desert. So, we'll talk about that. So good. That's you make them resistant to drought. You know.
the yard?
Yep. I mean, it's better than nothing. They'll find a way to get that water, but it's not the place that it's easiest for them to get. So it is kind of the homeowner's job to then extend that system out, you know, or to pay somebody to come back and do it. And you can't blame the people who install. They also set your timer for every single day, and they have to do that too, because that 5 gallon pot or that 1 gallon pot, you have to, we water it every day in the nursery because it dries out in a day. And this whole getting resilient, you know, it means the roots are going to grow down into that soil, following the water down to 3 feet deep. So it's a process, you know. It's like it's up to the homeowner to kind of continue after those guys are to the next house. That's a good example of how drip emitters could wet the whole area. That's 4 drip emitters making a pretty good wet spot. If your wet spots were half that, you could add drip emitters that watered twice as much output, you know. If the so that's just what you're trying to do. Good example of what you're trying to get to. That's about as good as you can get with drip emitters when you water. This was a little experiment I did. I threw a piece of that poly tubing on the surface of the ground, put 2 emitters about 4 feet apart. One was a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter on the left, and one was a 4 gallon an hour drip emitter. So the flow was different, right? You could see the water coming out of the 4 like a stream, and the 1 is like you could barely see there's any water coming out of it. So I turned it on for the same amount of time. You can switch the slide. So they both ran for 2 hours, right? Runtime same. So this is a good example of what does it affect when I change my runtime on my timer. I had a 1 gallon an hour drip emitter on the left, and what you see is I dug down, like I was telling you, you could find out how deep you're soaking in the water. I dug a hole and left a profile so that you could see the wet soil behind the ruler. That's a 1 foot yellow ruler. And so they both soaked in about the same depth is the point. So why? Because it was 2 hours. 2 hours, it doesn't matter if you got a 10 gallon per hour drip emitter or a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter. If they run in this soil, if they run in this soil for 2 hours, they're soaking in a foot. That's what happened. What's the difference though? Why would I switch to 4 gallon an hour drip emitters? The width of the wet spot is twice as much on the right as it is on the left. So the heavier the flow of the drip emitter, the wider the wet spot. And the longer you run it for, the deeper it soaks in. Those are the 2 factors that kind of are proven with this little experiment. Go ahead. Get it moving. Okay, so we're watering correctly. The frequency of irrigation is where we really focus on conservation and to make the plants more resilient. So I had to go through all that about the depth and the getting the whole area wet under the plant to get you to the point where I don't want to tell you to keep stretching out your frequency of irrigation more and more when you're incorrectly water it, for example, you know. So if you're not soaking it in deep enough, none of this will work. And if you're not getting the whole area wet under the plant, none of this will work. But now that you know that, we could talk about really stretching these plants to the extent of what they can handle as far as like going without water. And by doing that, you do 2 things. One, you save water, obviously, because we're watering less often and less often and less often. The other thing that you do is force those roots of that plant to get deeper and wider and stronger. The little bit of suffering makes them stronger, you know, what doesn't kill them makes them stronger. So that's what we're trying to do to these plants. And in the end, you get a plant that can survive a lot of drought and still be healthy as they would be out in the desert on their own, you know. So next slide. So factors that these are things that could make it where you water more often or less often, right? Because you do it. That is what I don't change my run time throughout the year. My soil's my soil. It's never going to change. I don't change my start time. What time of day can be the same all year round. What I do change on a timer is the frequency. It's the only thing I go in and change all the time on my timer. Why? Because the climate changes. The humidity changes, wind, temperature, rainfall. You can go through all those and put them up probably. That's it. And oh no, yeah, that's it. So humidity is a big one that most people don't notice. So what I do, so the summer starts like in May and June, it's super dry, and I got to water the most often of ever. The second the monsoon season starts, like usually mid-July, I can back off watering a lot because the humidity makes plants stay wet longer. Dry air just sucks the water out of them. Windy, dry air is the worst case scenario. So May and June is like the peak of watering the most frequently there is in the year. But don't forget, you can back it off when it gets humid. The worse it feels. That's what people don't get, because to a person, when it gets humid in August, it's like the worst month of the year, right? It's that you think like my plants are going to need more water than ever because I'm hot and sweaty. But to a plant, the more humid it is, the less water they need, and the drier it is, which feels better to us. I mean, I'd prefer May any day over August, but that's May is going to be a higher water use than August for a plant. So again, it's just trying to understand how plants work. Soil type we talked about, you know, soil like that really sandy, gravelly soil that takes water so quick, it also dries out quick. So if you have really sandy soil, you're gonna water more often than if you had really heavy clay soil that when you soak it into 3 feet deep, it lasts weeks versus sandy soil might only last days, you know. So soil type is something to consider as far as how long you can go without water. Plant type, you know, there's plants that can handle more. Cactus obviously can go a lot longer without water than leafy stuff. Plant age or size, you know, a really big leafy shrub is going to need a lot more water than it did when it was a tiny baby one, you know. Gallons of water, not often. They're going to need a lot more gallons of water when you water it. So size and health of the root system is the big one. That's what we're trying to do. Big, healthy root system. The way leafy plants store water is in the root system. Cactus store it above ground. That's their specialty. You know, cactus and succulents, they store water above ground. Regular trees and shrubs, they store water, but they store it underground in the root system. Roots, when there's water available, roots grow to suck it up, and they stay full of water until they use it up. So if you can see the root system, it grows and dies and grows and dies and grows and dies all the time. It grows to store water. And so if you get that root system big and fat and full of water, they can go a long time without it again. That's what they're supposed to do. What especially desert adapted plants, what they're made to do. Microclimate just means like plants with some windbreak, for example, like if you had them in a sheltered spot, wouldn't need water as quickly as plants that are out in the open where it just really whips by, something like that. And maintenance, we talked about hedging plants, makes them need a lot more water than if you left them more natural. Go ahead. This is about, and this is something that if you look at there's this little book too about irrigation, and it's over there for free. Really good one about irrigation. It's a good starting point. And the back page has a nice little chart about how often to water plants. But I've had the problem before where I say, follow this chart, and what's in fine print at the bottom is it's for established plants, 1 year for a shrub and 3 years for a tree. Newly planted plants would never go this long without water. So it's from the first, you can see right there, week 1 and 2 after you plant something in the ground, it's almost every day. And then at week 3 and 4, it's every couple days. And then 5 and 6, it's 4 to 6, you know what I mean? It's like a process. The frequency changes from the first day you put it in the ground is every day like we do in the nursery. And in 5 years from now, it's the way they would live out in the desert should be this progression, you know? But that you can't go straight to 5 years from now today when that plant's out there and wait a week to water it. you got to water it more often. So that's just an example of you got to worry about those brand new planted stuff. So all this, how all these factors about how often to water, and I'm going in and trying to change my drip system to compensate. To me, the easiest rule is right down to the dirt. If the soil's dry on the surface, you could water again. If you're trying to, that's the first rule. If it's wet, don't water it. And if your drip system is about to come on and the soil's still wet, absolutely back it off, because now you're watering too much, So that you want this cycle of like the surface dries out, and then you wait until the surface dries out and you water, and then you wait until the surface dries out again, and then you water. That's the most frequently you could water. What about the least frequently you could water? So what we're trying to do here is force those plants to suffer a little bit of drought so that they create this big root system, knowing that they have to have that to survive these periods of drought. Next slide. So if you really want to stretch out those frequencies, then you watch the plant. First thing you watch is the soil to tell you if you're watering too much. If you're watering not enough, you watch the plant. The one on the right is wilted. Does that everybody notice that, right? It's like soft, like wilted lettuce or whatever. The leaves would be like that to the touch, and they're all drooping down. If you watered that, it would come right back. If you watered it today, tomorrow it would look like the one on the left. The one in the middle is the trick that most people don't notice is a sign of drought, and it's probably the one to watch for. The one in the middle is if you let your plant wilt like that and then brought it back and let it wilt and brought it back, they end up naturally compensating. So for every leaf on the tree, it needs a certain amount of water. If there's not enough water to support all those leaves, the tree or shrub, leafy tree or shrub, strategically drops certain leaves off. They're the oldest leaves. So they're going to be the ones in the middle of the plant that are in the shade of the other ones. So right there, they're not as necessary anymore. It's the most important leaves it owns is the tippy tips. Those are the brand new ones that are fresh and they're working good and they're not in the shade of the rest of the tree. So if there's not enough water for all the leaves, they start turning yellow and dropping out of the middle. And if you could see in the pot there, it's full of yellow leaves that just fell out. And if you notice, it's a little thin, it's like not as dark green and leafy full as the one on the left that's getting plenty of water. So if you wanted to look for like that tree in the middle, there's no fear of dying. It's just a sign, and it takes a long time, weeks. You'll notice over the period of weeks, if you're not giving it quite enough water, it'll turn yellow in the middle and fall out. So a little thin, and that would be a sign that maybe you water a little more frequently. If you notice the wilt on the right, obviously it means you went a little too far. But again, not fatal. That neither one of these are like fatal. If you pay attention to your landscape often, that's the problem, is sometimes people look at their landscape every couple weeks and something like this could happen and then you would lose something. But none of it's like a death sentence tomorrow. So it's some things to watch for. Next slide. This is desert plants, right? These are Texas sage. The one on the left is lots of water, which is fine when they're young. Maybe you get them growing like that. It's healthy. But as it gets bigger and older to the size that you want, instead of keeping it hedged all the time because it's growing like crazy, then you can start backing off water to the point where maybe it looks like the one in the middle. The one in the middle is a little wilted, and they can handle that. What happens is if they wilt too often like that, they'll look like the one on the right, and they're just, again, remember, thin in the middle. So if you start looking thin in the middle, probably you need to beef it up a little bit more often, water more often. But that's the line you're riding. It doesn't kill them to do that. You just might get a little bit thinner plant for a while until you bring the water back. So that's the range that you're working with. The next slide. There's a bunch of them here for different signs of drought. Yeah.
Citrus wine.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't used to be. They ever lose? Got yellow starting.
So a citrus Mexican lime tree is losing yellow leaves right now. Yeah, it's common that the old leaves from last year, they start falling off right now as the new shoots are going to come out soon. It's just a leaf exchange. Old leaves don't work as good. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, you could. Yeah. Yep. And you'll notice sometimes it happens in the end of spring too, because they put out all this new growth and then it starts getting dry. And so if it's not getting enough water, it'll drop the yellow leaves again out of the middle of the tree. That's from the drying out. And it's also natural. I mean, you also lose a lot of baby fruit that time of year, May, say, because it's like they produce all these fruit thinking it might stay. I wish it would stay that way all year, but when they realize it's not, they start compensating for the drier weather and the drought, you know.
And you didn't get fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're thorny and stuff. So if the arborist is coming to trim it, I would just watch that they don't trim. What you don't want somebody to do trimming wise on a citrus or any tree really is expose, take off so much leaf that light really gets into the middle of that plant. So what they could do is go and thin it a little bit. You leave that crown of leaves, you know, but you take out a little branch here that might be something wrong with it, stunty, bushy, whatever, and you thin the inside of it out a little bit, but still just make sure that they're not like chop all half off the top or that's the point, is you don't want a lot of light. Same. And what I do is little by little. I mean, that's more like your guys's would probably do it. Just one branch that citrus, limes and lemons especially get these whips that come out like this, you know? And when you catch one of those whips starting to grow really fast, nip it off, and where you do, it branches out instead of being like a 5 foot long whip thing. Wherever you trim it, it's going to make branches. Yeah, fruitless olives. You can do exactly the same thing. Yeah. Yep, same thing. When those big long whips come out of them, you trim them back to whatever length, and they'll bush out from there. Yeah, and it's always, remember, always better one by one. You don't have to worry about what time of year it is or all that. Just little by little. Yep. And same thing here with even a more tropical kind of leafy thing. This is the one on the left is suffering a little drought. Thin in the middle, leaves turn yellow and fell out, but it's not dying anytime soon, you know. You bring the water back, you know, you can trim a little bit, bring the water back, and it fluffs right back out. But that would be a sign that you pushed it to the limit, which is kind of what we're trying to do, you know. You're trying to find that line between like water enough to keep them somewhat acceptable, healthy looking, but making them suffer enough drought before they do to get that root system growing deep and strong to hold a lot of water. So palms also show drought with these yellow leaves. All palms, the old leaves turn yellow, but when that yellow gets further and further and further up to the where the new leaf comes out of the middle, it's a sign of drought, that they're not getting quite enough water. It's one side of drought. So I think the next slide is yeah, the different. So the agave on the left is, that's what agaves do when they dry out real bad, is like shrink up around their core. The new growth, it's protecting the new growth that's coming out the middle until the water comes back, and then they open back up. So a little bit of yellow color on that you can see too, is like some drying out, is the yellowy color. And even cactus can eventually dry out. I look for that little bit of, I would almost, on a cactus, I wait for the wrinkles to form a little bit, because that shows that now they're finally to the point where they are as dry as they can be. The branch that folded down like that is probably a little too far, and they don't lift the branch back up very well. What I would do is trim that pad off that's hanging straight down, and it would be back to normal in no time. The reason I ride the line on drought so much with cactus is because you can kill a cactus very easily with too much water. When you do that, they rot at the bottom, stinky, gross mess. They fall over, and they don't come back from that. They come back from this, no problem at all. It's what they're made to do, is shrivel up a little bit. Next slide's a columnar cactus. This could be like a saguaro or an organ pipe, or this is a cirrus cactus. And those ridges, the pleats in them, like an accordion kind of, they can fatten up so much they're almost a cylinder, and then they can shrink down to be really deep pleats like that. So where my fingers are between is real skinny. The color is a little bit yellow, starting to yellow up a little bit. That's the end of where I would water them at this point. But the same thing, you deep soak. People want to like squirt cactus off thinking maybe I'll put too much on at once. You can never overwater anything all in one day. Nothing. Anything out there, you could leave the hose on for 24 hours straight and you wouldn't hurt it. Overwater comes from never drying out over a long period of time. So that's the difference between, always give any plant as much as you can all at once. You know, a long deep soak, get that water soaked in 3 feet deep, even on a cactus, but just don't do it again until the soil dries out. Maybe until you see some kind of signs of drought. That's the point of this whole section. Oh, wow. That's it. So, um, I didn't check where I was at on time, but we got time for questions, right?
Yeah, we have-
Yeah, plenty.
It is email address on the first one.
Yeah, for sure. And if anybody has questions about specific species of plants that they've been having trouble with, or I didn't talk anything about individual types of plants, just the basics. So now if you have any questions, yeah.
We have. Well,
Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So the question was, 'cause I
How
gotta,
do you keep running? Is your way to keep running
that,
other than ripping them out?
yeah, so the question was that the Aurelia Cades, which are not usually a nice little mounding plant, does real well here, survives the heat, the cold, whatever. Comes back from the cold, but they don't survive bunnies very well, is the problem. So yeah, so there is just, I've had people give me lists of bunny resistant plants, every one of them that bunnies will eat whatever if they're starving to death, that list gets like shorter, whatever, what do you know what I mean? It's like they'll eat anything if they're starving, and then if they're fat and happy, there's certain favorites that they always love. So really, Katie's probably one of the favorites, But so I don't know. I have had mixed. Yeah, well, and not everybody has the problem with the rabbits, So I mean, like I say, I usually recommend it too. It's a nice plant, but in that particular case, I don't know how to keep bunnies off of plants that they just really love to eat, other than switching it out for a plant that they wouldn't as much. Obviously, I don't think they like golden barrels much at all. Seems like it would be hard. I know that they do sometimes they'll eat juicier cactus, but I think golden barrel is probably a pretty good choice.
Facing back door, or front yard, you have a problem with when the sun goes south, because cats not getting enough sunlight.
It should be fine because in the summer they're gonna get really heavy light in the early morning and late afternoon, and that keeps them going through their growth cycle. Just keep them on the dry side. Too wet on the north side would definitely hurt them. So I would cap the drip emitters on. Don't put drip emitters on them. Water them with the hose. Cap them off. Yeah, cap them off the drip emitters. Deep soak them with the hose. Like probably not at all through the winter, but starting in the summer, on like a once every 2 week cycle, not knowing your soil type and all that would be a good guess to start. Yeah, I mean yeah, that's a good one. Golden barrels. I think it's the most popular cactus in the world, But that'd be a good one. So it's just probably changing. I mean, I've seen people put fences around stuff for the bunnies, but then you're looking at the fence. I mean, so it's whatever, it's like whatever you think to do is probably yeah. Or the bush grows through it, or so whatever. Yeah. So yeah, yeah.
So
Okay, a saguaro cactus. Mm, give me the hard ones. Yeah, yeah.
And so three of the side.
A saguaro is the
Same.
yeah, it has like an arm coming out on that side, the other side. Yeah. Yeah. Is the tip pretty good, or is it
Yeah.
still?